Try this. Picture a Tuesday with no alarm, no inbox, no meeting on the calendar, no boss expecting anything from you by 5. Not a vacation day, not a weekend, which still has its own quiet obligations attached. Just a regular Tuesday with absolutely nothing you have to do. No errands stacked up for later. No notifications waiting on a screen somewhere. Your brain probably can't hold that image for more than a few seconds before it starts inventing a task to fill it, cleaning something, checking something, planning something. And that reflex, that itch to fill empty time with obligation, is new. It is maybe 10,000 years old, which sounds ancient until you realize humans existed for roughly 30 times that long before it ever showed up. For most of those 300,000 years, a Tuesday like the one you just imagined wasn't a fantasy. It was simply Tuesday. Every Tuesday. And every day after it. There was no job to go to because the job, as a concept, hadn't been invented yet. No wages, no boss, no career ladder waiting to be climbed one rung at a time. And yet somehow, people survived, ate, raised children, buried their dead, and built entire cultures without a single one of them ever clocking in anywhere. So what exactly filled their day, if not work the way you understand it right now? Start with the number that breaks most people's assumptions on contact. In the 1960s, anthropologist Richard Lee spent time documenting exactly how the Juhuanzi people of the Kalahari spent their hours. Not guessing. Tracking. Counting. Meal by meal. Hour by hour. What he found was that adults spent something like 17 hours a week on activities directly tied to getting food. Less than 2.5 days. The rest of the week, roughly 5 full days out of 7, belonged entirely to them. If this were a one-off fluke of one group in one desert, you could dismiss it as an outlier and move on. It isn't. Researchers studying the Hadza in Tanzania found nearly identical numbers. So did researchers working with the Ashe in Paraguay and the Martu in the Australian outback. Different continents, different climates, different diets, from desert roots to rainforest game. Same rough answer over and over again. Somewhere between 15 and 20 hours a week spent on pure survival. For comparison, you probably clear double that before Wednesday even ends. Now, the obvious objection, and it's a fair one, these are modern people living in the present day, studied with modern tools. How do we actually know ancient humans, tens of thousands of years back, lived anything close to this? That question deserves a real answer, and the answer isn't guesswork. It's written directly into bone. When researchers compare the skeletons of hunter-gatherers to the skeletons of the first farmers who came right after them, the difference is almost uncomfortable to look at. The farmers are shorter, on average by a noticeable margin. Their teeth are riddled with cavities from a diet suddenly built around starchy grain instead of varied wild food. Their spines show early arthritis from years of repetitive bending, grinding, and lifting. They simply did not live as long, and the skeletal record shows that gap clearly across multiple regions and time periods. The hunter-gatherers who came before them, by contrast, were taller, had straighter spines, healthier enamel, and far fewer signs of overuse injury. Whatever they were doing with their days, it was not grinding, repetitive labor performed from dawn until dark. So if their days weren't consumed by survival, what were they actually filling all that spare time with? This is where the evidence gets genuinely strange, because some of what archaeologists have dug up should not exist at all if life back then was one long, unbroken emergency. Start with Chauvet Cave in southern France, discovered in the 1990s by a small team exploring a sealed limestone passage. Deep inside, painted somewhere around 30,000 years ago, are horses, lions, and rhinoceroses rendered with shading, motion, and layered perspective. Not crude outlines scratched in a hurry. Deliberate, skilled compositions, some animals drawn mid-stride with multiple overlapping leg positions to suggest motion, centuries before anyone would have a word for animation. Someone crawled deep into total darkness carrying a small stone lamp and spent what was very likely hours, maybe days, painting animals that weren't a threat that day and weren't dinner that night. They did it, as far as anyone can tell, purely because they wanted to. Then there's Blombos Cave on the South African coast, where archaeologists uncovered tiny seashells roughly 100,000 years old, each one deliberately pierced with a small hole so they could be strung together into jewelry. The nearest coastline sat a considerable distance inland from the cave. Someone made that walk out and back purely to gather decoration, then spent additional hours patiently drilling each individual shell with a sharpened stone point, all so it could eventually be worn and looked at by someone else. And in a cave in Germany, researchers recovered a roughly 40,000-year-old flute carved from a hollow bird bone, with finger holes spaced precisely enough to play a recognizable scale. Whoever carved it understood pitch, understood spacing, understood music as a thing worth building a physical object around, worth the hours of careful, patient carving that a bone flute demands. None of this fed anyone. None of it kept anyone warmer through winter. It existed purely because a mind with spare hours decided to make something beautiful and then kept doing it. Multiply this pattern across sites in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and something consistent emerges. Wherever humans had time left over from securing food, they used it to decorate, to carve, to make music, to make meaning out of raw material that served no survival purpose whatsoever. This is not what a species does when every waking hour is a desperate fight to stay alive. This is what a species does when survival takes up a small fraction of the day, and there's a great deal of day left over afterward. In the 1960s, anthropologist Marshall Solins looked at exactly this kind of evidence and coined a phrase that still makes economists uncomfortable. He called hunter-gatherer societies the original affluent society. Not affluent because they had more possessions. The opposite, actually. Affluent because their wants were small and easily met, which left enormous stretches of time completely unclaimed by obligation. Wealth, in his framing, wasn't what you owned. It was how much of your own time you got to keep. So picture what an actual day probably looked like, stitched together from everything the evidence tells us. You wake near sunrise, not because anything forces you to, but because that's simply when your body naturally surfaces. Last night's fire has burned down to embers, and someone, not necessarily you, feeds it back to life. Breakfast is whatever's left from yesterday: meat, fish, a handful of nuts gathered the day before. Nobody eats in silence. Breakfast is where the day gets loosely planned out loud, not because anyone has to, but because that's simply what people do when they wake up surrounded by other people they've known their entire lives. By mid-morning, a small group might head out to hunt or gather, but here's the detail people consistently miss. This wasn't every single day for every single person. If the last hunt went well and there's food stored nearby, plenty of mornings are spent doing something else entirely. Sharpening a spear, weaving a basket, working a hide until it softens in your hands. Nobody is standing over anyone with a clock or a quota. The work gets done because skill matters. Because being good at something earns you standing inside the group, not because a shift technically started at a certain hour. Children, meanwhile, weren't tucked away out of sight the way modern life tends to separate work from parenting. Anthropologists studying groups like the Ache and the Hadza have documented something called alloparenting, where childcare gets spread across aunts, grandmothers, older siblings, and unrelated adults, not just a single set of parents. A child might spend the morning with one adult and the afternoon with three others, absorbing skills simply by being nearby while adults worked, talked, and occasionally let a curious kid try holding the tool themselves. When a hunt does happen, it rarely looks like the dramatic chase you'd see in a nature documentary. Humans are, among other things, extraordinary endurance predators. We can sweat efficiently while running, which most four-legged animals cannot do nearly as well since they cool primarily by panting. That single physiological advantage lets a small, patient group jog an animal into exhaustion over several hours, tracking it at a steady pace until it simply can't run any further. It's slow, methodical, occasionally boring, and often over by early afternoon. Which is exactly where things get interesting, because early afternoon is roughly when the actual demands of the day come to an end. What fills the rest of it is the part modern life has almost completely erased from daily experience. Rest. People sit in the shade. They groom each other, an activity that sounds trivial until you realize it's doing the same social job a long, unhurried conversation does for you, reinforcing bonds one small, repeated gesture at a time. They make beads. They carve small designs into bone or wood. They nap when they feel like napping, without needing to justify the nap to anyone. Researcher James Sussman, studying the Juhuansi decades after Lee's original fieldwork, documented something like 6 hours a day spent purely in what he called social time. Not working, not sleeping. Just existing near other people, talking, laughing, occasionally arguing over something small and forgettable by the next morning. In a world with no money, no police, and no written contracts, your survival depended entirely on whether the people around you liked you enough to share when you personally had nothing. So those hours weren't wasted time at all. They were the actual infrastructure holding the entire group together, quietly, day after day. Then the sun goes down and something shifts. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Wiesner reviewed hundreds of hours of recorded conversation among the Juhuansi and found a clear, consistent split. Daytime talk stayed practical. Disputes, complaints, who saw which tracks where and how fresh they looked, but once night fell and everyone gathered close around the fire, more than 80% of the conversation turned into something else entirely. Stories. Myths about how the world came to be. Tales about ancestors doing impossible, larger-than-life things. Jokes that landed the same way every single time they were told. News carried in from distant relatives days away. Wiesner's argument is that this, right here, by firelight, is where a huge amount of human culture was actually assembled, piece by piece. Gods, legends, shared history, the kind of thinking you only get to do once your stomach is full and nothing nearby currently wants to eat you. And sleep itself worked differently than yours does. Historical records from medieval Europe, combined with modern sleep research conducted in the 1990s, point to something researchers call segmented sleep. A first sleep of around 4 hours, followed by an hour or two of quiet wakefulness spent sitting in the dark, followed by a second sleep of another 4 hours. That middle stretch wasn't dead time either. It was often used for quiet reflection, low conversation between two people lying near each other, or simply lying still in the dark thinking, undisturbed by any expectation to fall back asleep quickly. So add it all up. Something like 4 to 6 hours a day spent on food or tools, around 6 hours spent purely on social connection. Roughly 8 hours of sleep split cleanly across 2 separate phases instead of one long block, and the remainder spent doing essentially nothing in particular, sitting, watching, existing without needing to justify a single minute of it with visible output. Then, about 10,000 years ago, everything changed, and it changed for good. In the region known as the Fertile Crescent, people began deliberately planting seeds and keeping animals instead of only gathering and hunting whatever the land already offered. Agriculture, for all the long-term good it eventually made possible, turned out to be something close to a trap in the short term. Farming could feed more people packed into a smaller area than foraging ever could, which meant populations grew. Growing populations needed more food to sustain them, which meant more farming, more cleared land, more coordinated labor. There was no clean way back to the old rhythm. Too many people now depended entirely on a system that only kept working if everyone kept feeding it, season after season, without pause. And that system demanded far more from the human body than foraging ever had. Plowing, weeding under a hot sun for hours at a stretch, storing grain carefully enough that it wouldn't rot or spoil before winter, guarding stockpiles from animals, and, increasingly, from other hungry people. The skeletons confirm exactly what you'd expect from all of that. Early farmers worked longer hours, ate a narrower and noticeably worse diet, and died younger than the hunter-gatherers who came directly before them. But the population kept climbing regardless of the individual cost, and larger populations eventually needed specialists, people who only made tools, only shaped pots, only wove cloth from morning to night. Then came soldiers to defend the growing surplus, administrators to track and divide it fairly, or unfairly, and eventually the idea that your own hours could be handed over to somebody else entirely in exchange for a small, agreed share of the harvest. That idea never really went away once it took hold. It just grew a suit, a badge, a punch card, and eventually a monthly paycheck. So here you are. You spend something like 90,000 hours of your entire life at a job that simply did not exist for 99% of human history. You sleep in one solid, uninterrupted block and quietly call it a disorder the moment it splits into two. You chase goals invented by a system that needed you predictable and productive, not goals your body or your ancestors ever once asked you to chase. They woke up each morning with nothing to prove, and nobody keeping score in the background. You make art in the leftover margins, squeezed in after the job is finally done, if there's anything left of your energy by then. They made art in the middle of an ordinary afternoon simply because the day had room for it, and nobody was waiting on them to finish. We are not a different species from the people who lived that way for 300,000 years. We just built a world so far removed from that original rhythm that most days it barely feels related to it at all. We traded a short, modest list of hours spent finding food for an entire lifetime spent finding purpose inside something we were never actually built to need in the first place. Somewhere back there, underneath everything you've added since, a version of you already knew exactly how to fill a Tuesday with nothing scheduled on it and still walk away from it calling that a good day.